Cognitive Neuroscience, Chapter 2. Some questions of interest. What are the fundamental structures and processes within the brain? How do researchers study the major structures and processes of the brain? What have researchers found as a result of studying the brain? Cognitive neuroscience is originated in the 1970s by Gazzaniga, who was a student of Spurry, who was a student of Lashley, and he was a student of John Watson. One of my mentors, by the way, was a student of Gazzaniga. So Gazzaniga is my academic grandpa, and Spurry is my academic great-grandpa. Cognitive neuroscience is a discipline that combines cognitive psychology and neuroscience. Now, reasons why psychologists use information from the neurosciences include the need to find physical evidence for theories of the mind, the work of computer scientists who are attempting to simulate human cognition, the need to find correlates between brain pathology and behavior, and the development of techniques such as CAT scans, which allows for a better look at the brain. Now let's talk a little bit about the brain structure. The brain evolves by adding the new advanced layer on top of the old primitive ones. Just think about an ice cream that you add a scoop of different kinds of ice cream on top of each other. The surface of the brain, if you spread it out, would measure about 324 square inches or 18 by 18 inches, which is also equivalent to 45 centimeters by 45 centimeters. In a human brain, there is 1 million gigabyte worth of information stored. Now, the cerebral cortex is the gray area with 5 millimeter thick, is for higher order functioning. It is divided into two hemispheres, which we will discuss more later. The frontal lobe of the cortex processes judgment, problem solving, personality, and intentional movement. It contains primary motor cortex. The parietal lobe contains primary somatosensory cortex and is involved in attention and visual spatial processing. Temporal lobe is involved in auditory and facial processing. The occipital lobe is involved in visual information processing. The forebrain. Now let's take a look at the motor cortex, which is located at the posterior of frontal lobe. Now, what's interesting about these cortexes are that the brain devotes more tissue to sensitive areas and requiring precise control. For instance, facial expression is vital to communication. Our face is also equipped with many important organs such as eyes, mouth, and nose. As you can see in this diagram, way more brain areas are allocated for the face than any other body parts except hands. In contrary, the brain area allocated specifically to the legs and knees are super tiny. This is because these body parts don't require precise control in order to properly function. Now, anatomy of the limbic system, also known as the lizard brain, includes septum, which is involved in anger and fear. Amygdala is involved in anger, aggression, and fear. Hippocampus is important in formation of memories. Thalamus relays sensory information to the cerebral cortex. It also helps to control sleep and waking. Hypothalamus, meaning beneath the thalamus, regulates the species' survival behaviors, emotions, and reaction to stress such as fighting, feeding, fleeing, and mating. It also plays a role in sleep and helps govern the endocrine system. The midbrain helps to control eye movement and coordination. Reticular activating system controls respiration, cardiovascular function, digestion, alertness, and sleep. Brainstem is vital in the basic attention, arousal, and consciousness. The hindbrain includes medulla oblongata, which keeps us alive. Basic life support functions such as heart rate, breathing, swallowing, blood pressure, and digestion. Pons, meaning bridge, is a relay station. It triggers the onset of REM sleep or rapid eye movement sleep. Pons also contains part of the reticular formation and is involved in sleep and arousal. Axons within the pons cross over from one side to the other. Cerebellum is involved in motor coordination, posture, maintaining balance, muscle tone, procedural memory such as riding a bicycle and driving a car. Now it is also involved in planning and coordination of complex motor skills. So we have two hemispheres or two brains, and they are connected with massive bundle of 200 million neural fibers called corpus callosum. You have probably seen an image like this, which I'm showing on the screen, showing each hemisphere has different functions, and if you are artistic, you have the right brain personality. If you are detail-oriented, you are the left brain personality. Now, let me tell you this. This is simply wrong. And, or I should say it is half wrong, and here's why. It is true that the brain is localized. The right hemisphere processes holistic and spatial information better than the left hemisphere, so when we process a face, a map, or location of our body parts, we use the right hemisphere more than the left. The left hemisphere processes categorical, analytical information such as language and math better than the right hemisphere. But think about this. If you are a musician, you must be artistic, therefore you must have the right brain personality, right? But you also need to be able to read the music note, which is a language, so you use the left hemisphere. In this ad, if you are a scientist, you must use the left brain more than the right because supposedly you love categorizing information. But without the ability to holistically analyze the information, you're literally missing a big holistic picture. So when we use our brain, yes, it is true that it is localized for specific functions, but we also use the brain as a whole to process a variety of information. As a matter of fact, both hemispheres are connected with corpus callosum to allow constant communication between them. Now, the brain processes different information in a different way. For example, tactile, auditory, about half of visual information are processed in the opposite side. This is called contralateral. The right side of brain controls left side of the body, and the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. Not all information is contralaterally processed. Olfactory and about half of visual information are processed in the same side. This is called ipsilateral. In other words, if you smell something with your right nose, that olfactory information will be processed in the right hemisphere. Finally, gustatory information is bilaterally processed. This means when you taste yummy soup, you process the taste with both of the hemispheres. Now, one more thing. This left-right configuration is true only for the right-handers and some left-handers and ambidextrous. If you are non-right-handers, your brain configuration may be reversed, or you may use both hemispheres to process different information. And as you can see in this picture, there are tons of fibers connecting the both hemispheres. Next, hemispheric specialization. The first scholar who documented the hemispheric differences was Paul Broca, French neurologist. One day in 1861, he had a patient who generally understood what he was said but had difficulty speaking. In fact, all he was able to say was 10, and his right body was also paralyzed. A few days later, Tan passed away. Broca knew Tan's left hemisphere was damaged because of his paralysis in the right side of the body, so he speculated the language center must also be in the left hemisphere. He visited Tan's family and begged to obtain his brain, which is kind of an odd request. After a close examination of the brain, he found a significant damage to the left hemisphere, Now it's called Broca's area. He was super excited, so he brought the brain to the conference, but everyone laughed at him because before his discovery, no one thought language is processed in the left hemisphere. And this picture is the actual brain of Tan. It took several years for the medical and scientific community to realize Broca was actually correct. Today, this area in the frontal lobe of the left hemisphere is called Broca's area. Damage to this region results in loss of productive speech called motor aphasia or Broca's aphasia. Patients with Broca's aphasia have relatively normal comprehension but cannot verbalize their thoughts. By gestures, patients can accurately describe the sequence of their loss of function. Okay, next, Karl Wernicke, a German physician, had a patient in 1876. He speaks fluently but nonsensically. He was incoherent and constantly made lexical and grammatical errors. It turns out the left temporal lobe was damaged in this patient, and now it's called Wernicke's area. Patients with Wernicke's aphasia or sensory aphasia have difficulty in language comprehension, and they often experience anomia, which is unable to say nouns. For example, they may say food for cookies or this for the chair. Because most patients of Wernicke's aphasia are fluent, you may not notice if their speech is impaired if you don't know the language they use. If you can understand English, make no sense, but if you don't speak German, you wouldn't notice if the second guy also has Wernicke's aphasia. Now, Wernicke made an important contribution to understanding of language function and the brain, and he proposed parallel processing model. This model allows two alternative pathways to be used if part of the pathways are destroyed. Wernicke was one of the earliest scientists to recognize that some brain functions operated in parallel. Now, as we saw the case of Tan and the other patient of Wernicke, much of the early information on brain functions came from the study of head trauma. Okay, so here is the diagram of the two guys fluently speaking, but they don't make any sense. Okay, split brain studies. Now, split brain studies, which were originally conducted by Sperry, he was the first to study the split brain patient with the split corpus callosum. These patients have severe epilepsy and experience seizures hundreds of times per day. Researchers found that it can be dramatically reduced by separating the right brain and the left brain by cutting the bridge, and it actually worked. But after the surgery, interesting things happened. For example, after being released from the hospital, one patient was trying to put on underwear with his right hand, but his left hand tried to take it off. When he was arguing with his wife, one hand tried to punch her face while the other tried to stop it. When he was picking a shirt in the closet, his one hand wanted a red one, but the other wanted the blue shirt. Eventually, though, both of the hemispheres started to learn to cooperate with each other, so no such conflict occurred while after the surgery. This was possible because although major communication bridge corpus callosum does not exist anymore for the split brain patients, bottom of the hemispheres are still connected. Because brains are malleable, they find a way to communicate with each other. Now, a study of Sperry Gazzaniga, who founded Cognitive Neuroscience, tested split brain patient WJ. The patient was able to replicate the block design using blocks with the left hand, but not with the right hand. This does not occur to healthy individuals whose corpus callosum is intact. Gazzaniga's findings confirmed that the left hand is contralaterally controlled by the right hemisphere, which effectively processes spatial information. Here's another task to test hemispheric differences. Okay, that was my dog. Split brain patients are asked to stare at the dot in the middle of the screen. Two different images simultaneously shown to each side of the brain. The right hemifield or visual field is processed in the left hemisphere, and the left hemifield is processed in the right hemisphere. When they were asked what they saw, they would say apple, but wouldn't be able to say wrench because it was projected to the right hemisphere only, which does not have the language capability. But if they were asked to point out what they saw with their left hand, they would correctly point out the wrench. This will not happen to healthy individuals because their corpus callosum is intact. By the way, each eye perceives images from both the right and the left visual fields, so just by closing your one eye does not shut down either of the visual fields. Now, you don't have to cut the bridge between the hemispheres in order to study hemispheric differences. In this dichotic listening task, participants hear a different list of words in each of the ears. Right-handers will be more accurate on the latter task for stimuli heard in the right ear than in the left ear, because the left hemisphere is the language center. Here's another dichotic listening task with this time letter and melody. A left ear advantage is observed when the participants are tested on the melodies. In contrast, a right ear advantage is observed when they are tested on the letters. So far, we have been discussing this hemispheric specialization, and this is also known as laterality effect, which indicates that a particular cognitive function of behavior is primarily dependent on activity in only one of the two hemispheres. Left hemisphere effectively processes analytical information such as classification, analysis, language, that includes grammatical and phonetic understanding, conceptualization, and skilled movement. So if you have the left hemisphere damage, you may develop apraxia. Apraxic patients are unable to produce coordinated actions even though their strength is intact and they can move their limbs. It's not that they cannot move their limbs, but they cannot do pantomime actions such as pretending as if they are brushing teeth without a toothbrush or drinking imaginary water from an imaginary cup. The right hemisphere effectively processes holistic information. This includes art and music, spatial processing, semantic knowledge, and face. People with damaged right hemisphere tend to have deficits in following conversations, making inferences from context, and understanding humorous speech. I love watching comedy shows like John Oliver's Last Week Tonight and The Daily Show with Trevor Noah and all the other comedy shows. So it is going to be devastating if my right hemisphere is damaged so that I cannot understand the humor. By the way, many tasks can be performed successfully by either hemisphere, but they may differ in efficiency. Some mental attributes are localized, but many functions are distributed throughout the brain. Damage to the brain does not always lead to a reduction of functions, as knowledge is thought to be distributed throughout the brain. So you may ask, why information crosses to the opposite side of the brain? Breitenberg 1984 proposed the following explanation from the evolutionary perspective: coward versus aggressor. Now consider this. Let's say that you are a car with two light sensors which are connected to the rear wheels. If you are the coward, you move away from the light source when the light hits your right sensor because it is directly connected to the right wheel. On the contrary, if you are the aggressor, the right sensor is connected to the left rear wheel, whereas the left sensor is connected to the right wheel. So when your left sensor receives the light, it powers the right wheel, resulting you to get closer to the light source. This is an advantage because 1, it's easier to find food, and 2, it's easier to see predators so you can hide to avoid being eaten. This contralateral function may allow us to survive. Now next, in a postmortem study, researchers first identify a disorder, then examine the brain after death. This picture shows the brain of a patient with Alzheimer's disease who died at 67. Her brain was only 750 grams. A normal brain usually weighs from 1,000 grams to 1,500 grams, so her brain could have lost half of its mass before she passed away. So here's another picture of the brain. Now, scientists conduct studies with animals when cannot be done with humans for a variety of reasons. One of such studies is the single-cell recording. In this procedure, activity of a single neuron is monitored with a very thin electrode probe that records electrical activities on the brain. This allows researchers to study precise locations of the brain that activate for specific tasks. Selective lesioning is another procedure. Researchers surgically remove or damage part of the brain to see the effect of the lesion. With humans, you cannot purposely destroy the brain, so this procedure is used only to animals. This figure to your right illustrates Carl Lashley's study using pigeons. He wanted to investigate if cutting different parts of the brain has an effect on behaviors. He found that no matter how many cuts he made, the brain regains the ability to function normally. Although his discoveries were later found not to be completely accurate, he showed an evidence that the brain can work as a whole organ. Genetic knockout procedures are another procedures that are used by scientists to study cognition. This creates animals that lack certain kinds of cells or receptors in the brain and investigate if it has an effect on the brain. Now with humans, researchers cannot use invasive techniques, but there are a variety of procedures available that can be used to study human brain. One of them is EEG. EEG records electrical activity in the brain. It measures frequencies and intensities with electrodes by placing them at various places along the surface of the scalp. Unlike single-cell recording procedures, no needles are sticking on your brain, so it does not hurt or does not damage your brain. This technique is good for recording changing mental status such as deep sleep or dreaming over relatively long periods because it is very sensitive to changes over time. There is a major limitation though. Information is not well localized to specific cells, so there is no way to tell which part of the brain is more activated than others. CT scan. CT scan is an X-ray based technique that can generate 3D images to observe large abnormalities of the brain, such as large strokes or tumors. Images are taken by an X-ray machine that rotates around the skull. Limitation of this technique is low resolution. It cannot provide much information about smaller lesions and abrasions, and you cannot examine physiological activities. Next, MRI. Just like CT scan, it takes 3D images by creating strong magnetic field that is passed through the brain of a patient. A rotating scanner detects various patterns of electromagnetic changes in the molecules of the brain, and it is now possible with the MRI and fMRI to capture images in as little as 30 milliseconds. With this technique, detailed information about its structures can be obtained, but limitation is that it is super expensive. It also does not provide much information about physiological processes. So here comes position emission tomography or PET scan. Mildly radioactive form of glucose is injected or inhaled, then participant is scanned to produce an image of the brain's activity. It captures 3D images and tracks use of glucose consumption in the brain. This procedure records images of physiological functioning of the brain in action, but because participants are given the radioactive form of glucose, you don't want to use PET scan too many times in short time period, even though it should not be invasive. Next, functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. It takes a series of images of the brain in quick succession by tracking the use of oxygen consumption and then statistically analyzes images for differences. The rationale is that the brain areas with more blood flow have been shown to have better visibility on MRI images, and better visibility is thought to be correlated with brain activation. fMRI machine creates a magnetic field that induces changes in the particles of oxygen atoms. What's great about this procedure is that it does not require a radioactive form of glucose. This technique is good for recording images of physiological functions of the brain in action and is less invasive than PET scan. It also creates higher temporal resolution. However, this procedure is not free from limitation. It is super expensive and time-consuming for participants. And also, it can be very scary for kids. So that's why, as you can see in this picture, they created the ship so that the kids are less scared when they are scanned with fMRI. Next, transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, is the device I would buy it if I can, especially if they can figure out to make TMS device that can be operated in distance. TMS temporarily disrupts functioning of a particular brain area. An electrical current passes through a coil on a person's head, generating a magnetic field. So unlike selective lesioning, in which part of the brain must be destroyed or removed, this procedure is reversible and does not leave any damage to the brain when it is turned off. For example, the right temporal parietal junction, or RTPJ, is thought to be responsible for moral judgment. If you temporarily disable your friend's RTPJ, she temporarily becomes immoral, if she was not an immoral person before the treatment. So here is the temporal parietal junction. Okay, so that's the end of the chapter. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.